Cornelius reminded one of everything that is unsavory. His slow, laborious walk resembled the creeping of a repulsive beetle, the legs alone moving with horrid industry while the body glided evenly. Jim told me he had been received at first with an abject display of the most amicable sentiments. But if I got 3 meals in 2 days, I considered myself jolly lucky, and he made me sign a chit for $10 every week, said he was sure Mr. Stein did not mean him to keep me for nothing. He did his best to make out that Mr. Stein owed him money on the last 3 years' trading, but his books were all torn and some were even missing. Jim could never discover what had become of all the trade goods. There was nothing in the store but rats. When Jim escaped to Doramin, old Tunku Alang got frightened and returned all his things, but as soon as he left the Bugis quarter and went to live with Cornelius, it began to be said openly that the Rajah had made up his mind to have him killed before long. However, Jim hung on there because he sympathized deeply with the defenseless girl, at the mercy of that mean, cowardly scoundrel. It appears Cornelius led her an awful life. Doramin had sent over twice a trusty servant to tell him seriously that he could do nothing for his safety unless he would recross the river and live amongst the Bugis as at first. People of every condition used to call, often in the dead of night, in order to disclose to him plots for his assassination. Finally, one night, Cornelius himself, with a great apparatus of alarm and secrecy, unfolded in solemn wheedling tones a little plan wherein for $100, or even for 80, well, let's say 80, he, Cornelius, would procure a trustworthy man to smuggle Jim out of the river, all safe. There was nothing else for it now. If Jim cared a pin for his life, what was $80? A trifle. Jim confessed to me that he did not sleep a wink after the fellow had gone. He lay on his back on a thin mat spread over the bamboo flooring, listening to the rustlings in the torn thatch. By and by he heard stealthy footsteps. They stopped. Her voice whispered tremulously through the wall. "Are you asleep?" "No. What is it?" Jim had answered briskly. "Have you considered to what I spoke to you about?" asked Cornelius. "No," shouted Jim in a passion. "I did not, and I don't intend to. I'm going to live here in Patusan." "You shall die here," answered Cornelius in a sort of expiring voice. "Nothing can touch me. You can do your damnedest," Jim had shouted back. The row seemed to have done him good, though, because he went to sleep for the rest of the night like a baby. Hadn't slept like that for weeks. But I didn't sleep, struck in the girl who was sitting with us. I watched. In the morning, Cornelius made no allusion to the events of the night. "I suppose you will come back to my poor house," he had muttered surlily, slinking up just as Jim was entering the canoe to go over to Doramin's campong. Jim only nodded, without looking at him. He retired early that night. When he rose to say good-night, Cornelius jumped up, knocking his chair over, and ducked out of sight. Jim's slumbers were disturbed by the girl. She was holding a damar torch at arm's length aloft, and in a persistent, urgent monotone she was repeating, "Get up, get up, get up." She put his revolver into his hands. He gripped it, bewildered, blinking in the light. He wondered what he could do for her. The girl said quickly, "You were to be set upon while you slept." She moved off swiftly, and he followed her into the courtyard. They stopped in the rank grass. The light in which they stood made a dense blackness all around, and the flame of the torch streamed with a fluttering noise like a flag. For a time, this was the only sound. "They're in the storeroom, waiting," whispered the girl. "They're waiting for the signal." "Who's to give it?" he asked. She shook the torch, which blazed up after a shower of sparks. "Only you have been sleeping so restlessly," she continued in a murmur. "I watched your sleep too." "You?" he exclaimed, craning his neck to look about him. "You think I watched on this night only?" she said with a sort of despairing indignation. If Sharif Ali's emissaries had been possessed, Jim thought, of a pennyworth of spunk, this was the time to make a rush. He seemed to hear the grass rustle, and he stepped smartly out of the light. Something dark, imperfectly seen, flitted rapidly out of sight. He called out in a strong voice, "Cornelius! Oh, Cornelius!" A profound silence succeeded. "Fly!" the girl cried. "Fly! They're frightened now. They know you're awake now. They know you are big, strong, fearless. Can I always be watching? Go to Doramin. Go to Doramin." The sobbing catch of her breath affected Jim beyond the power of words. He felt that if he went away from her, it would be the end of everything somehow. He made up his mind to go and look into the storehouse, and he let her follow him without thinking of any protest. "Wait till you hear my voice," she said, and torch in hand ran lightly round the corner. Not a sound, not a breath came from the other side. Then he heard a high-pitched, almost screaming call from the girl. "Now, push!" He pushed violently. The door swung with a creak and a clatter, disclosing to his intense astonishment the low, dungeon-like interior illuminated by a lurid, wavering glare. A conical, ragged heap of old mats cumbered a distant corner almost to the ceiling. And that was all. "Fire! Defend yourself!" the girl outside cried in an agonizing voice. "There's nobody here!" yelled Jim contemptuously. But in the very act of turning away, he perceived that he was exchanging glances with a pair of eyes in the heap of mats. Next moment, the whole mound stirred, and with a low grunt, a man emerged swiftly and bounded towards Jim, his right arm raised with a crooked elbow and the dull blade of a kris protruded from his fist. Jim held his shot for the 10th part of a second, and then he fired. The explosion in that confined space was stunning. He saw the man jerk his head up, fling his arms forward, and drop the kris. Striding over the dead body, he covered with his revolver another naked figure outlined vaguely at the other end. As he was about to pull the trigger, the man threw away a sort of heavy spear and squatted submissively on his hams, his back to the wall and his clasped hands between his legs. "You want your life," Jim said. The other made no sound. "How many more of you?" asked Jim. "Two more, Tuan," said the man very softly, looking with big, fascinated eyes into the muzzle of the revolver. Accordingly, two more crawled from under the mats, holding out, ostentatiously, their empty hands. Jim shepherded them out and down to the river. "Take my greetings to Sharif Ali till I come myself," he said. Not one head of the three budged. "Jump!" he thundered. The three splashes made one splash. Black heads bobbed convulsively and disappeared. But a great blowing and spluttering went on, growing faint. Jim turned to the girl, who had been a silent and attentive observer. His heart seemed suddenly to grow too big for his breast and choke him in the hollow of his throat. She flung the burning torch with a wide sweep of the arm into the river, and the calm, soft starlight descended upon them, unchecked. "I love her dearly," Jim told me, "and I believe I am equal to all my luck. I've been only 2 years here, and now, upon my word, I can't conceive being able to live anywhere else. The very thought of the world outside is enough to give me a fright, because I have not forgotten why I came here. Not yet." I heard a short sigh. "Upon my soul and conscience," he began again. If such a thing can be forgotten, then I think I have a right to dismiss it from my mind. Ask any man here, who is it they would trust with their lives? They would say, "Twan Jim." And yet, they can never know the real truth, no matter. I am satisfied. Nearly. I've got to look only at the face of the first man that comes along to regain my confidence. I haven't done so badly. Not so badly, I said. But all the same, you wouldn't like to have me aboard your own ship, huh? Oh, confound you, I cried. Stop this. Aha, you see, he cried, crowing, as it were, over me placidly. Only, he went on, you just try to tell this to any of them here. They would think you a fool, a liar, or worse. And so I can stand it. I've done a thing or two for them. But this is what they've done for me. On my last day, as soon as Jim, with Tam at his heels, had started upon his evening rounds of the town, I went up to the house alone, and unexpectedly found myself waylaid by the girl who'd been clearly waiting for this opportunity. She caught hold of my arm firmly, and as soon as I had stopped, she withdrew her hand in haste. She feared nothing, but she was a brave person groping in the dark. I belonged to the unknown that might claim Jim for its own at any moment. She supposed I could whisk him away, and her pathetic pleading, her helplessness, appealed to me with almost the strength of her own unreasonable and natural fear. I protested that I had no intention of taking Jim away. Why did I come, then? I tried to explain briefly. Friendship, business. If I had any wish in the matter, it was rather to see him stay. They always leave us, she murmured. Nothing, I said, could separate Jim from her. He swore he would never leave me. He swore to me. And it is possible that you do not believe him? I asked, sincerely reproachful, genuinely shocked. I heard her quiet whisper again. Other men have sworn the same thing. My father did. Why is he different? Is he better, is he? She put an extraordinary force of appeal into her supplicating tone. He says he'd been afraid. How can I believe this? Am I a mad woman to believe this? You all remember something. You all go back to it. What is it? You tell me. What is this thing? Is it alive? Is it dead? I hate it. It's cruel. Has it got a face and a voice? This calamity? Will he see it? Will he hear it? In his sleep, perhaps, when he cannot see me, and then arise and go? Why did he come to us from out there? He speaks of you too often. You make me afraid. Do you want him? I said bitterly, I don't want him. No one wants him. No one? She repeated in a tone of doubt. No one, I affirmed. If only she could believe it. There was no one else who would need his heart, his mind, his hand. Why should she fear? I asked. She knew him to be strong, true, wise, brave. He was all that, certainly. Why not believe him to be true, too? I shall go tomorrow. You shall never be troubled by a voice from there again. You've got his heart in your hand, and the world does not want him. Why? She murmured. Why? Tell me. And she stamped her foot like a spoiled child. You want to know? I asked in a fury. Because he is not good enough, I said brutally. This is the very thing he said. You lie. I could hear the sobbing labor of her breath, and I slipped away without another word. Cornelius ran towards me upon the path, his feet shod in dirty white shoes. His dried-up little carcass was swallowed up, totally lost in a suit of black broadcloth. I had been vaguely aware of his desire to confide in me, if he only could get me all to himself, and I let him capture me without even a show of resistance. Nothing mattered, since I had made up my mind that Jim had at last mastered his fate. He had told me he was satisfied. Nearly. It didn't matter who suspected him, who trusted him, who loved him, who hated him, especially if it was Cornelius who hated him. The man was too insignificant to be dangerous. Cornelius declared himself the most unhappy of men, a victim, crushed like a worm. He wanted me to intercede with Jim in his favor. It seemed he regarded himself as entitled to some money in exchange for the girl. He had brought her up, somebody else's child. In consideration of a suitable present given at once, he would, he declared, be willing to undertake the charge of the girl without any other provision when the time comes for the gentleman to go home. I stood there and marveled. "In his case, Mr. Cornelius," I said, "he will never go home." "Never go? Ah," he shouted. He comes here from devil knows where, comes here devil knows why, to trample on me till I die. Who is he? What does he want here? He's no more than a little child here, like a little child." He leaned his forehead against the fence, and in that position uttered threats and horrible blasphemies in Portuguese, in very weak ejaculations, mingled with miserable plaints and groans, coming out with a heave of the shoulders, though he had been overtaken by a deadly fit of sickness. It was an inexpressibly grotesque and vile performance, and I hastened away. Next day, I left Patusan, and Jim accompanied me on the first stage of my journey back to the world he had renounced. The shadow of the impending separation had already put an immense space between us. I remember the smallest details of that afternoon. We landed on a bit of white beach. It was backed by a low cliff, wooded on the brow, draped in creepers to the very foot. A chain of islands sat broken and massive facing the wide estuary. A ragged, sooty bunch of flimsy mat hovels was perched over its own inverted image upon a crooked multitude of high piles. A tiny black canoe put off from amongst them with two tiny men who toiled exceedingly, striking down at the pale water. This bunch of miserable hovels was the fishing village that boasted of the White Lord's especial protection, and the two men crossing over were the old headman and his son-in-law. They landed and walked up to us on the white sand. The old man began at once to state a complaint. The Rajah's people would not leave them alone. There'd been some trouble about a lot of turtles' eggs his people had collected on the islet. Jim listened for a time, and at last told him to wait. He would hear him by and by. They withdrew obediently to some little distance and sat on their heels. "The trouble is," remarked Jim moodily, "that for generations these beggars of fishermen in that village there had been considered as the Rajah's personal slaves, and the old rip can't get it into his head that..." He paused. "That you've changed all that?" I said. "Yeah, I've changed all that," he muttered in a gloomy voice. "You've had your opportunity," I pursued. "Have I?" he said. "Well, yes, I suppose so. Yes, I have got back my confidence in myself, a good name. Yet sometimes I wish... No, I shall hold what I've got. Can't expect anything more." He flung his arm out towards the sea. "Not out there, anyhow." He stamped his foot upon the sand. "This is my limit, because nothing less will do." We continued pacing the beach. Yes, I've changed all that, he went on with a sidelong glance at the two patient, squatting fishermen. But only try to think what it would be if I went away. Jove, can't you see it? Hell loose, no. Tomorrow I shall go and take my chance of drinking that silly old Tunku Alang's coffee, and I shall make no end of a fuss over these rotten old turtles' eggs. I must go on forever holding up my end, to feel sure that nothing can touch me. I must stick to their belief in me to feel safe and to keep in touch with... His voice sank suddenly to a murmur. With those whom perhaps I shall never see any more. With you, for instance. A small boat leaving the schooner moved slowly towards the sandbank to take me off. And then there's Jewel, he said out of a great silence. Yes, I murmured. I need not tell you what she is to me. She trusts me too. His tone changed. When shall we meet next, I wonder? Never. Unless you come out, I answered. He didn't seem surprised. Goodbye, then, he said after a pause. Perhaps it's just as well. We shook hands, and I walked to the boat, which waited with her nose on the beach. Will you be going home again soon? He asked, just as I swung my leg over the gunwale. In a year or so, if I live, I said. Tell them, he began. The half-submerged sun faced him. I could see its red gleam in his eyes that looked dumbly at me. No, nothing, he said, and with a slight wave of his hand motioned the boat away. I did not look again at the shore till I had clambered on board the schooner and saw Jim on the beach watching the schooner fall off and gather headway. The twilight was ebbing fast from the sky above his head. The strip of sand had sunk already under his feet. He himself appeared no bigger than a child, then only a speck, a tiny white speck that seemed to catch all the light left in a darkened word. And suddenly, I lost him. 2 years passed before I was able to finish Jim's story. It's difficult to believe, I wrote to a friend, that I shall never hear his voice again, nor shall I see his smooth, tan and pink face with the white line on the forehead and the youthful eyes darkened by excitement to a profound, unfathomable blue. It all began with a remarkable exploit of a man called Brown, who stole with complete success a Spanish schooner out of a small bay near Zamboanga. Till I discovered the fellow, my information was incomplete, but most unexpectedly, I did come upon him a few hours before he gave up his arrogant ghost. However, 8 months before this, coming into Samarang, I went as usual to see Stein. At the door of his room, I came upon Tambi Tam. I asked him at once what he was doing there. It occurred to me that Jim might have come on a visit. I was pleased and excited at the thought. Tamb Itam looked as if he didn't know what to say. Is Tuan Jim inside? I asked impatiently. No, he mumbled, hanging his head, and then with sudden earnestness, he would not fight. He would not fight. He repeated twice. As he seemed unable to say anything else, I went in. Stein, tall and stooping, stood alone in the middle of the room between the rows of butterfly cases. Ah, is it you, my friend? He said sadly, peering through his glasses. What's the matter now? I asked, nervously. There's Tammy Tam there. Come and see the girl. She is here, he said. They came here 2 days ago. Come, this way. She recognized me at once. He has left me, she said quietly. You always leave us for your ends. It would have been easy to die with him, she went on, and made a slight, weary gesture as if giving up the incomprehensible. He would not. It was like a blindness, and yet it was I who was speaking to him. It was I who stood before his eyes. It was at me that he looked all the time. Ah, you are hard, treacherous, without truth, without compassion. What makes you so wicked? Or is it that you are all mad? Her steady eyes seemed to strain after the shape of a man torn out of her arms by the strength of a dream. She made no sign to my silent bow. I was glad to escape. I drove back to town the same afternoon, taking with me Tammy Tam and another Malay, in whose seagoing craft they had escaped in the bewilderment, fear, and gloom of the disaster. The man, Brown, had been the show ruffian on the Australian coast. He had deserted from a home ship in the early gold-digging days, and in a few years became talked about as the terror of this or that group of islands in Polynesia. He lost his ship on some rocks off Malaita and disappeared for a time, as though he had gone down with her. He was heard of next at Nuka Hiva, where he bought an old French schooner out of government service. It is evident that what with high commissioners, consuls, men of war, and international control, the South Seas were getting too hot to hold gentlemen of his kidney, and he shifted the scene of his operations further west, and seems to have hung around the Philippines, battling with an adverse fortune. His tale goes that when a Spanish patrol cutter captured him, he was simply trying to run a few guns for the insurgents. My belief, however, is that he was blackmailing the native villages along the coast. The cutter, throwing a guard on board, made him sail in company towards Zamboanga. On the way, both vessels had to call at one of those new Spanish settlements, where there was a good, stout, coasting schooner lying at anchor in the little bay, and this craft, in every way much better than his own, Brown made up his mind to steal. In Brown's crew, there was a Solomon Islander, kidnapped in his youth and devoted to Brown, who was the best man of the whole gang. That fellow swam off to the coaster, 500 yards or so, with the end of a rope in his teeth. The crew of the coaster, all Taglas, were ashore having a jollification in the native village. The two shipkeepers left on board woke up suddenly and saw the devil. It had glittering eyes and leapt quick as lightning about the deck. They fell on their knees, paralyzed with fear, crossing themselves and mumbling prayers. With the long knife he found in the caboose, the Solomon Islander, without interrupting their supplications, stabbed first one, then the other. With the same knife, he set to sawing patiently at the anchor cable till suddenly it parted under the blade. Then, in the silence of the bay, he let out a cautious shout, and Brown's gang began to pull gently at their end of the warp. In less than 5 minutes, the two schooners came together with a slight shock and a creak of spars. Brown's crowd transferred themselves without losing an instant, taking with them their firearms and a large supply of ammunition. They were 16 in all, 2 runaway bluejackets, a lanky deserter from a Yankee man of war, a couple of simple blonde Scandinavians, a mulatto of sorts, 1 bland Chinaman who cooked, and the rest of the nondescript spawn of the South Seas. None of them cared. Brown bent them to his will, and Brown, indifferent to gallows, was running away from the spectre of a Spanish prison. The weather was calm, and the stolen craft slipped away silently into the night. They got clear away, but they were short of food and water. Brown did not dare to put into any port, of course. He had no money to buy anything, no papers to show, and no lie plausible enough to get him out again. His idea was to make for Madagascar, where he expected, on grounds not altogether illusory, to sell the schooner in Tamatave. But before he could face the long passage across the Indian Ocean, food was wanted. Water, too. Perhaps he had heard of Patusan, or perhaps he just happened to see the name written in small letters on the chart, probably that of a largest village up a river in a native state, perfectly defenseless, far from the beaten tracks of the sea. A cargo of produce for the schooner perhaps could be extorted, and who knows, some real, ringing coin money? Some of those chiefs and the village headmen could be made to part freely. Luck served him as to weather. In less than a week he anchored off the Batukring mouth within a pistol shot of the fishing village. 14 of them packed into the schooner's longboat and started up the river, while 2 remained in charge of the schooner with food enough to keep starvation off for 10 days. The tide and wind helped, and early one afternoon the big white boat under a ragged sail shouldered its way before the sea breeze into Patusan Reach. The Rajah's stockade gave no sign. The first houses on both sides of the stream seemed deserted. A few canoes were seen up the reach in full flight. Brown was astonished at the size of the place. A profound silence reigned. However, the head man of the fishing village at Batukring had managed to send off a timely warning. When the longboat came abreast of the mosque, which Doramin had built, a structure with gables and roof finials of carved coral, the open space before it was full of people. A shout went up, followed by the clash of gongs all up the river. From a point above, 2 little brass 6-pounders were discharged, and the round shot came skipping down the empty reach, spurting glittering jets of water in the sunshine. The tumult of war cries, the vibrating clang of gongs, the deep snoring of the drums, yells of rage, crashes of volley firing made an awful din, in which Brown sat, confounded, but steady at the tiller, working himself into a fury of hate and rage against these people who dared to defend themselves. 2 of his men had been wounded, and he saw his retreat cut off below the town by some boats that had put off from Tunku Alang stockade. He perceived the entrance of the narrow creek, the same which Jim had jumped at low water. It was then brim full. Steering the longboat in, they landed and established themselves on a little knoll about 900 yards from the stockade, which, in fact, they commanded from that position. The slopes of the knoll were bare, but there were a few trees on the summit. They went to work cutting these down for a breastwork and were fairly entrenched before dark. Meantime, the Rajah's boats remained in the river with curious neutrality. When the sun set, the 14 desperate invaders lying flat behind the felled trees raised their chins to look over at the stir of the town that seemed to extend upriver for miles and swarm with thousands of angry men. But round their position, everything was still, dark, silent. Jim had been away in the interior for more than a week, and it was Dane Warris who had directed the first repulse. That brave and intelligent youth wished to settle the business on hand. He had not Jim's prestige and the reputation of invincible supernatural power. Since my visit, Jim had carried out his intention of making out of his house a place of defense. It consisted of a deep ditch, an earth wall topped by a palisade, and at the angles, guns, mounted on platforms to sweep each side of the square. Doramin had agreed to furnish him the guns so that each man of his party would know there was a place of safety, upon which every faithful partisan could rally in case of some sudden danger. The chief men of the town elected to assemble in Jim's fort for deliberation upon the emergency. The women and children from the lower part of the town had been sent into the fort at the first alarm. Here, Jewel was in command. and at the council held at 11 o'clock in the evening in Jim's dining room, she backed up Warris's earlier advice for immediate and vigorous action. Old Doramin, who had not shown himself outside his own gate for more than a year, had been brought across with great difficulty. A certain Haji Saman argued that by the use of proper stratagems, these evil-minded strangers could be destroyed without the risk of a battle. The old rogue Kasim, who represented the Rajah at the council, spoke little, listened smilingly, very friendly, and impenetrable. Doramin sat fierce-faced, heavy, looking at the speakers in turn. As the chief man there, his word would have been decisive, but well aware of his son's fiery courage, he dared not pronounce the word. Dane Warris, in his father's presence, would offer no opinion, though the girl entreated him in Jim's name to speak out. Finally, when the council broke up, it had been decided that the boat itself was not to be interfered with openly, so that the robbers on the hill should be tempted to embark when a well-directed fire would kill most of them. To cut the escape of those who might survive, and to prevent more of them coming up, Dane Warris was ordered by Doramin to take an armed party of Bugis down the river to a certain spot 10 miles below Patusan, and there form a camp on the shore and blockade the stream with the canoes. Several messengers were dispatched in different directions after Jim, whose exact whereabouts were unknown. But before then, Kasim had managed to open communications with the besieged Brown. That accomplished diplomat and confidant of the Rajah, on leaving the fort to go back to his master, took into his boat Cornelius, whom he found slinking mutely amongst the people in the courtyard. Kasim had a little plan of his own, and had wanted him for an interpreter. Thus it came about that towards morning, Brown, reflecting upon the desperate nature of his position, heard from the marshy, overgrown hollow an amicable, quavering, strained voice crying in English for permission to come up, under a promise of personal safety and on a very important errand. The voice declared itself a white man, a poor, ruined old man who had been living here for years. Brown called out, "Come on, then, but alone, mind." Half an hour's confidential talk with Cornelius opened Brown's eyes to the home affairs of Patusan. But before he would talk over Cornelius's proposals, he demanded that some food should be sent up as a guarantee of good faith. Cornelius went off, creeping sluggishly down the hill on the side of the Rajah's palace, and after some delay a few of Tunku Alang's men came up, bringing a scanty supply of rice, chilies, and dried fish.